Okay, so I talked a lot about the different kinds of hunting that you see on land. So whether you're hunting small game, whether you're hunting for sport, whether you're hunting for fur, but obviously there's a huge amount of other things you can go hunting in the water. So very, very sort of broad. You can look at freshwater, you can look at saltwater and the sea. And the medieval person didn't ignore this at all. There was a huge amount of fishing that went on, whether it would be on the coastal or slightly into deep waters. You don't get the same kind of fishing that we did from the 17th and 18th century when you're looking to really deep waters and going whaling and that sort of thing. It tended to be relatively close to the coast, but they were very inventive in the way. So things like lobster pots and crab traps were used. There's a really interesting way that they could use using tidal fishing. So our tides tend to have about, depending where you are in the country, maybe 2 or 3 meters worth of difference between the water level at high tide and low tide. So one of the practices they did in the medieval world is at low tide people would build an arc-shaped wall, so sort of a semicircle wall. Then as the tide comes in, the water washes over that wall, the fish come with it, and they sit inside this wall, everything's fine and good, and the fish swim around. As the tide goes out, this wall holds an amount of that water in place, and with that it holds the fish in place. So you can then go wading out and you can go for the fish. And it stops the fish escaping quite so easily, makes it a little bit easier to get them. And this is one of the items that was recovered. So this was recovered just off the coast of, just off the shore of Hull. And it's thought to be basically a fish harpoon. So the little notches on there and the spike, and you basically just thrust it down into the fish. So you get this enclosed space, this little sort of half circle of wall that holds the seawater in place at low tide, and you can go jabbing down for your fish and you can catch your fish. They were also using nets as well. So this is something called a netting needle. Now in one of the other videos I showed you one of the rabbit nets that you can use to put over the rabbit warrens. The same thing would be used just on a larger scale. So this allows you to weave your string, your rope will be looped around here, and you use this like a needle to tie knots and create fishing nets. And these would be done in the same way, to be dragged over the side of boats, slung off of the shoreline to drop into the water with lead weights tied onto them, and then drawn in to catch any of the fish. And the fish would be used for all sorts of different purposes. There's kind of another odd thing, a little sort of side note. There's a kind of fish called a dogfish. Technically it's in the shark family, and sharks have a really unusual skin. So they have tiny little scales on their skin which helps them move really fast through the water and makes them what we call hydrodynamic, so they can move easily through the water. Now because the dogfish is technically part of the shark family, it has the same kind of skin. So it has these kind of little scales that are very rough. So people were hunting these dogfish, or sort of collecting dogfish when they go fishing. You could take the skin and you could effectively use it as sandpaper. So there's all sorts of these odd and interesting methods. They could use fish bones for hooks, for needles as well. So it wasn't just a case of using it for meat. In the medieval world, a lot of the animal was used as much as it possibly could be. Now when you move into freshwater, hopefully you can see this. You could use this in salt water as well. You can do more traditional fishing. So I don't know if you can see this easily. So this is just a fish hook. So this is beaten brass, and you can see the little notch on the end and a little eye there. Now today we use sort of kind of 21st century fibres to use for fishing line. It's incredibly strong for the thickness of it. The 15th century they didn't have access to that. So again, I don't know if you can easily see this, but this is my fishing line. So it's quite thin, it's quite light in colour, so it's very hard to see in the water for the fish to be able to sort of see that it's on the end of a line. And it's made out of horse hair, so horse tail hair. And I'm going to get a little bit graphic around it, but there's a reason behind what I'm going to say. So that we're using white male horsetail hair, and the reason for that, the white made the strand harder to see. It also tended to be a stronger strand than other colours of horses, and the reason that we're using male horsehair is female horses, when they urinate, splash urine onto the tail at times, and the urea in the urine weakens the tail hair. so it will break more easily. Now male horses, because of the way they are made, they don't wee on their tails. So the tail doesn't get that urea, the strands in the hair of the tail stay stronger. So if you use white male tail of horses, you get a light coloured strong fishing line. You spin it together, you weave it together, and you go fishing with it like that. Now there's a few books that were written at the time, and there were some of the first ones that came out of the Gutenberg printing press. So it shows sort of how important fishing was that they decided to make actual printed books of it. And one of the stories I absolutely love about fishing, one of the techniques that they said was used, that I still do not know if this is a joke or if this is reality, but I love the story, is they would get a goose. They would catch a goose, and on the leg of the goose they would tie a fishing line, and they would have what's called a drop line. So you have a long line, and then dropping down from it you have lots of small lines which have little hooks on them, and you would bait the hooks and you would get the goose, and then you would chase the goose so it ran and then flew low across a pond or a river, and it would drag the tail behind it of the fishing lines, and these fishing lines would run through the water as the goose flew low over the water and hopefully catch some fish. And I guess at the other side somebody catches the goose, or the weight of the fish bring the goose down. I do not know, as I say to this day, if this is some kind of joke, but it was printed in a book from the 15th century. And to get to the point of printing is a huge amount of effort in the 15th century. It's not quite the same as sort of posting something up on the internet. It takes a huge amount of effort to get this into a printed manual. So the fact that it's there makes me think that somebody did it, but I love the story of this kind of fishing. But it wasn't just fish that people were catching. We ate a lot of seafood and a lot of river food, so prawns, shellfish, mussels, snails, all sorts of things. One of the other things that was really big at the time was eels. So these were really seen as a very high status food. Now they're not really eaten now, in fact they're protected in England because they've been so over-hunted, so overfished, that eels have become endangered. So they're very much protected. We can only eat a certain amount, we can only fish for a certain amount of them. But when they were served up, they were called lampreys. So the same way that a cow becomes beef when you serve it, an eel becomes lampreys when you serve it. And there was a king of England who actually died of eating a surfeit of lampreys, too many eels, and what the thought is that he ate so much it actually split his stomach, and he died of internal infection and some very unpleasant internal causes. But this was how popular they were. They were served to the king. So, you know, this is the guy who could eat anything he wanted, and rather than having beef steaks, he would have lampreys, he would have eels. So if you want to catch an eel, then you use an eel trap. So this is made out of willow, so when it's wet it's woven into the shape, and it's made out of two parts. And the idea of this is you put it into a river, and you have it so that the current of the river is flowing into the trap. So the eel's going in, you put some meat, or you put some bait at the bottom of this big section of the basket, and the eels slither their way in through this cone opening. And once they've got inside the basket, it's nice and big belly, they can all sort of get inside it. But when they try and swim out, they're both trying to swim against the flow of the river, which is difficult enough. But if you look at this side, it's very hard for the eels to get out. So a big opening for them to get in, very small opening so they can get out. So all you need to do is put this down at the bottom of the river, weigh it down with some stones, or tie it down with a bit of rope or something, weighted with some stones, let the water run through, come back later in the day, maybe the next morning, and see, pulling out of the river, if you've got some eels inside it. So another way that you can go hunting for a different kind of waterborne animal. So we talked about fish, we talked about other sort of waterborne animals. There's another one I kind of want to tell you about that would be used and hunted using something like this. So this looks kind of like a trident, and it is for hunting otter. So otters spend a lot of their time in the water. They're not exclusively waterborne animals, but they spend a lot of the time in the water. And they were very prized for their pelt. So because otters spend a lot of time in the water, they have a really thick fur that's almost totally waterproof. So it was very, very prized for being warm, being waterproof. So they were hunted pretty much to extinction in the UK. We got some otters back in the UK. You got some up in up on the Isle of Skye, up on parts of Scotland, but they're very, very rare in England now because they were so massively hunted through the rest of England during the medieval period and beyond. And the way that they would do this is, knowing the otters have their homes in riverbanks, they would use dog teams and go down either side of the river with the dog teams, so the dogs would prevent the otters running out into the undergrowth, into the grass and trees and running away. If they did, the dogs would get them. And they would flush the otters out of their burrows, of their homes, in the banking of rivers. And then men with these spears would walk down with the dog teams, waiting for the otters, and then bam, straight in. And the idea of this spear, the 3 points, and you can see these little notches on the point, so as it goes into the animal, the 3 points hold it much more securely, and then those little tines and little back spikes stop the spear coming out again. So you're almost definitely going to pierce the animal's skin, which is not ideal if you're going for pelt, but it's very, very hard to attack and catch an otter otherwise. So an otter hunting spear, you could use it for other things as well. You could use it for other larger animals. If you go forward into the 16th and into the 17th century, you see similar sort of things with more spikes at a more fanned angle, and they would use those for eels as well. So you would go in and you would stab down, so rather than trying to punch through the body of the eel, you would basically try and trap the eel in the very narrow section. But that's a little bit further forward in time. I haven't seen any eel spears from the medieval period, it's a little bit later. But definitely this is shown again by our friend Gaston Phoebus in one of his treatises as specifically used for hunting otters. So what I'm trying to sort of get across with this is the really wide range of animals that were hunted. Basically, if it had legs, if it had hooves, if it had flippers, if it had fins, it was game. We would go for almost anything, from the tiniest little shrews to the largest bears, from river eels to sea fish, to birds of the sky, to almost anything would be used in some way. Whether it would be used, for example, you've got knives that were hilted in antler. We would use it for meat, we would use it for cord, we would use it for clothing when you turn the hides into furs, all sorts of materials, not just the meat. Hunting was such an important part of the medieval world. It pervaded all parts and all depths of society. Everybody did it to some fashion, and it was incredibly important in the medieval world. So again, just a little bit more information about the different ways and the different animals that were hunted.